who is representing Professor Azikiwe Onwalu, the President of the Africa University of Science and Technology. And he will speak to us on capacity building, on trade policy and economic diplomacy. It might also delight us all to know that we have today in our midst our founder, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo Iweala, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, who has just completed a grueling board meeting for the last couple of hours upstairs and will join us downstairs shortly for a fireside chat. So while we wait for her arrival to the hall, we will begin with the presentation and then offer reflections on the presentation led by Professor Kingsley Moghalu and Ambassador Elijah, before starting out with questions and answers. To make this more effective and efficient, if you have specific questions you'd like to ask, please note them down, and at the end of the presentation, you will have an opportunity to ask. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Oyekwina.
Good afternoon, Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, experts on the field, and the collaborating organizations. Welcome to the launch of the Nigeria Economic Diplomacy Discourse, which is essentially a platform for deliberations and dialogues on economic diplomacy issues. It is a collaborative initiative of three organizations. One is Center for the Study of Economies of Africa, an evidence-based research organization that does policy-oriented research. NOIPolls is a leading polling organization in Africa. And AUST, it's an Africa-wide university based in Abuja, bringing in the capacity building aspect. I'll start by mentioning that diplomatic engagements are pivotal in nurturing both global peace and fostering economic development. Given the growing interdependence among countries, there is a compelling need that arises for a structured platform that facilitates deeper comprehension of these economic needs and opportunities of countries for maintaining diplomatic ties with Nigeria. So this Nigeria Economic Diplomacy Discourse meets this need for Nigeria and the respective foreign missions in Nigeria. It has several components as it's just starting. A key component is the trade and investment facilitation aspect. This will involve evidence-driven policy support to enhance trade facilitation in Nigeria, for trade between Nigeria and other countries, as well as the implementation of the WTO facilitation agreement. The CSEA and AUST, given their research expertise, will analyze trade and investment opportunities in Nigeria, which investors from partner countries can exploit. We intend to engage in studies on how to ensure more inclusive African involvement in WTO investment facilitation for development, as well as bringing analytical perspectives on issues such as export potentials, market access conditions, and trade maps, among others. A critical aspect of this discourse will be the capacity building aspect of trade policy. Trade policy within this region, the knowledge of trade policy is quite weak within the region. So we tend to conduct workshops and trainings that will build capacity of practical tools and strategies to enhance diplomatic efforts in Nigeria. There also intend to be studies on WTO trade facilitation agreements for informed lessons on multilateral trade policy. We also intend to be inviting eminent speakers for keynote addresses within the diplomatic space. It will also involve panel discussions that will bring experts from diverse perspectives, within the economic diplomacy space, diplomats, academia, business leaders, and government officials, fostering like a multi-dimensional dialogue on economic diplomacy. It also provides opportunity for networking opportunities, allowing participants to establish connections and collaborations among diplomats, business leaders, and other stakeholders. It also provides a platform for knowledge sharing. We will have publications on trade and investment and perception studies. And this is also a platform for that kind of knowledge sharing of those studies. Like I said, there will be perception studies that will try to understand the general public perception of various foreign missions work, as well as gauging the impact of participating countries with historical ties with Nigeria. So in essence, the schema here shows the collaboration within the three institutions on this economic diplomacy discourse. And the key outcomes are trade and investment facilitation, and improvement in trade policy knowledge, investment opportunities, knowledge and networking sharing opportunities, improved trade, and improved diplomatic ties. And the key beneficiaries are the Nigerian economy as well as the foreign nations. So that's the summary here of this Nigeria Economic Diplomacy Discourse. Thank you so much. And in conclusion, this stands as a timely initiative to amidst an increasing multipolar global economy, and we tend to provide a platform for nurturing diplomatic ties and fostering shared economic opportunities. And this will be given through insightful discussions, workshops, and research initiatives to contribute more interconnected and prosperous world guided by the principles of economic diplomacy. And on that note, I'll welcome you all and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Iweala. Now we'll hear from Dr. GK, who will share with us what are some of the perceptions that your audience has about the various nation states and their presence in the country, and how can NOIPolls sort of lead the efforts to facilitate data-driven insights on how people feel, think about how your embassies can connect and engage with Nigeria. Dr. Chike, you have the floor.
So the idea for why we're here, like, supposed to talk about the role of perception polls in improving diplomatic relations. It's a very quick conversation. This is just the beginning of several discourse, and the idea is to really introduce what perception polls are about and what it can contribute to this discourse. We know that perception polls are widely used to study opinions, attitudes, and behaviors of individuals. And as countries engage in public diplomacy, it's important to assess if there is foreign support for their desired policy outcomes. So in a sense, we're saying it's important to understand whether the country that we're trying to build relations with is in support of the directions that we're going. Several questions really ask whether foreign public opinions matter to Nigerians' opinion about various countries. Are they really important? And studies have shown that they are important and that countries can help change public opinion abroad in desired and expected ways under certain conditions. Specifically, work has suggested that countries' ability to change foreign opinion depends on whether targeted citizens are aware of the campaigning country's goodwill, correctly attribute the goodwill to the campaigning country, and perceive themselves as beneficiaries of that goodwill. So in essence, we believe that having regular perception polls in Nigeria is a credible means of understanding how Nigerians view other countries' relationship with Nigeria. And just a bit of intro about who we are, we've been introduced. NOIPolls is a Nigerian-based opinion polling and research organization founded by same NOI in 2006, and we try to just provide information on perceptions, attitudes, and preferences of the Nigerian population. We have a 15-man polling center right above this, right above where we're sitting. And we have a database of more than 80 million active telephone numbers of Nigerians 18 years and older, disaggregated by gender, age, local government, and state. And we also complement this with field research, both quantitative and qualitative, to be able to triangulate the data that we get. And some of the work that we've done in the past include work for USAID, Gates Foundation, FCDO, and the World Bank, just to mention a few. So we're reiterating what we're saying, that understanding perceptions of Nigerians on several issues will provide the right context for relevant policies and directions for peace building and improving economic development. And as a quick thought, there are three main areas that we think perception polls can contribute to this discourse. One, general views, basically trying to understand Nigerians' views of participating countries' relations with Nigeria in the areas of soft power in terms of the aid that they provide to the country, support for various government policies, perception of culture sharing across countries, and even topical issues and support of Nigerians for things like climate change and even during pandemics. We also think it's critical for us to look at migration, as we can try and understand the drivers of migration, how people perceive life in different countries, which could be motivation for migration, and then preferences and determinants of these preferences on why people decide to even migrate. And then more importantly, we also think we can look at trades and products from different countries, understanding the views of Nigerians on products and services that are provided by participating countries, and willingness of Nigerians to purchase from or do business with these countries. We could also try and identify challenges that surround businesses and livelihood and suggestions for improvement from the general public. And to just give a bit more insight in our methodology of doing this, like I said, we do our polling telephone polling, and Nigeria's tele-density is currently way above 97. As of 2021, it was at 97.45. So we feel telephone polling is a viable methodology of collecting data. Interviews are conducted by trained analysts, and some of the benefits that come from telephone polling is that it's a quick information turnaround, and you can probe in real time, because it gives us a bit more flexibility, and you can always change the subject matter based on whatever strategic direction we're looking at that point in time. There are some cons anyway, just to acknowledge that it's susceptible to response bias and response rate as well. We know the country we are in, it takes a lot of work to get the sample size that we like. And then if we want to look at subset of people, makes it a lot more difficult. Like I said, we have a 15-man call center, and we're able to have a database of like 80 million active numbers. Most of these numbers was built through face-to-face surveys as well as random digital dialing over the past 14 years. And it is disaggregated by age, gender, and state of residence. In our sample selection, we try for each round of survey to have at the very least 1,000 respondents. This enables us to be able to make disaggregations at geopolitical zone level, and we base our sampling on probability proportionate to population size, and our number database in proportion to the 2006 census, which was the last census that Nigeria has had. And we're able to stratify across the different disaggregations of the data, and this gives us a representativeness of our entire sample size. Our interviews are usually conducted in the major languages, making it easier for the respondent to be interviewed in his preferred language. We do that in Hausa, Yoruba, Pidgin, and as well as English based on the respondent's preferences. And we do this with software that enables us to assure the quality of what we do, and also do callbacks to what conversations went on. So that's just in summary of presenting how we intend to go about the perception polls and how we're able to provide information that is critical from Nigerians. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chike. I would now invite Dr. Emeka to share with us his presentation on behalf of the Africa University of Science and Technology. This presentation speaks more to capacity building on trade policy and economic diplomacy as an academic institution.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Evelyn, for the kind introduction. So I'm going to be speaking on behalf of Professor Onwalo, who is not just the president of AUST, but also the president of Nigeria Academy of Engineering. But I can assure you that you don't have too much engineering detail in the presentation. So our perspective from the school largely is on the role that trade policy has to play in economic diplomacy. We understand trade policy to mean the rules, the regulations, and the guidelines that regulate trading activities in a country, for example, like Nigeria. And for especially those of you who man the economic desk, we believe that understanding what Nigeria's trade policy is, or policies as they are essential for you to plan your diplomatic and economic engagements with Nigeria. Given that no country possibly produces all that it needs, international trade then becomes imperative. And if you look at some of the data from the WTO and the Council for Foreign Relations, you can see that in the last 30 years, international trade has created millions of jobs, it has catalyzed economic and social development, and has lifted over 1 billion people out of poverty, which reinforces the need for trade and trade policy. And so from an economic diplomacy perspective, a number of you who are here, excellencies and distinguished ladies and gentlemen, are already involved in economic diplomacy in one form or the other. But that speaks to how how you professionally manage a country's international relations, but when you have a more economic-centric perspective. You have a picture there of Nigeria's last engagement with the Qatari government, where both leaders are overseeing what the foreign affairs ministers are signing up. Part of it included the establishment of a joint business council between Nigeria and the Emirate of Qatar. And so, trade and trade policy can be understood to be the software, if you like, or the operating system of economic diplomacy. What we have subsequently is a diagram that just explains how we view trade policy. So, trade policy being the operating system that boots up economic policy and that guides the economic diplomacy and subsequently foreign policy. So it's critical, and it's not very new to Nigeria. In the 1980s, especially in 1987, trade policy was introduced into Nigeria. It was introduced by a gentleman, Ike Omar Sandawachukwu, when he was Foreign Affairs Minister. And he had what then was a novel idea for Nigeria's conservative foreign policy system, or foreign service system, if you like. The idea that the private sector had to have a prominent role within Nigeria's foreign policy and foreign service system. Prior to his stint as Foreign Affairs Minister, he was Minister of Labour. And as Minister of Labour, he introduced the National Directorate of Employment, where employment generation, human capital development, wealth creation, and economic growth were crucial. And so, even though he was from the infantry corps of the Nigerian Army and was a serving soldier when he became Foreign Affairs Minister, he had to really face and surmount stiff opposition from Nigeria's ultra-conservative foreign service system, who felt that trade issues and business issues should be on the sideline, and diplomats should be concerned with statecraft and linguists and all of that. And so, to understand why Nigeria had to introduce economic diplomacy officially, there's need to understand the context. A lot of you already know the background to Nigeria's economy. It was largely driven by agricultural commodities after independence, but up until the...
So sorry to interject. Please let's welcome our founder, Dr. Ngozi.
Thank you. So I'm supposed to go. To apologize. I really am sorry. I think I overbooked. I'm doing multiple things all at once.
Please go ahead, Dr. Emeka.
So again, we take it from the introduction of economic diplomacy in Nigeria by a serving military officer who seemed to have a more economic and business-oriented perspective to foreign policy than the then established foreign policy system. But the context within which economic diplomacy was introduced will be better understood from the structure of Nigeria's economy. Prior to before independence and after independence, you had a regional system of government, first of all. That explains the political context. And then from an economic perspective, you had an economy largely driven by agricultural commodities. But the Yom Kippur War of 1973 happened, and then you had the OPEC restrictions on oil supply to especially the US, which led to a bump in the price of crude oil. I don't think there's anybody here from the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, you had the Dutch disease. In Nigeria, you had a windfall. And the CBN governor then, Dr. Clement Isong, was one of those who cautioned against largely expanding the government wage bill, if you like, the economic structure, because the windfall meant that the military government at that time, in the post-war era, had to act the role of a messiah or a savior. And so the structure of Nigeria's economy changed. But from a perspective of economic planning, since the second National Development Plan of 1970 to 1974, there had been that drive, or if you like, that trade policy to ensure that Nigeria's economy is not largely driven by single commodities. And typical of where you have commodity-driven economies, the boom and bust cycles meant that from the period of the 1970s where money was not the problem but how to spend it, Nigeria ran into balance of payment crisis in the 80s. And that led to a structural adjustment program that was not very popular. And then the foreign service, foreign policy system in Nigeria had to adjust from having to think about the black bomb, the black atomic bomb, and the concept of medium powers, to now looking at how you have the private sector play key roles in Nigeria's economy. And so we may want to ask ourselves, do we have any semblance with the contemporary economic situation? In contemporary times, we have NEDD, Nigeria Economic Diplomacy Initiative, launched in 2018. It's a collaboration between Nigeria's Foreign Affairs Ministry and then the Ministry of Industry, Trade and Investment, and two agencies there in particular, the Investment Promotion Commission and the Export Promotion Council. And it has largely the same initiative and drive that Ike Nwachukwu introduced when he launched economic diplomacy. And so, attaining economic complexity, less reliance on crude oil as a major source of government revenue and foreign exchange still remains the key objective. So, this is an illustration of Nigeria's economy, where 80%, as at Q3 2023, over 80% of non-debt government revenue, as well as foreign exchange earnings, still driven from a single commodity, crude oil. And so we'll wrap up by talking about the trade policy of Nigeria, introduced a few months ago by the Minister of Industry, Trade and Investment. It has a number of objectives, but it's coming over 20 years after the last trade policy of 2002. And a number of the highlights are not very different from what we have from previous policies. But what we know from studies is that implementing such policies has been the main challenge with trade policies, and that is where AUST now comes in. AUST envisages a platform where you have accreditation from the WTO setup to run trade policy programs. The WTO has the e-learning academy, it has the distant learning platform, and it also has courses that are done at headquarters. But from little observation, or from some observation, we find that trade practitioners or stakeholders, especially from the developing countries, are not able to access such courses because of cost and, as little as some being unable to assimilate distant learning and e-learning platforms. So what you have next is a graphical demonstration of what we propose to do between African University of Science and Technology, CC, and then the WTO e-learning platform, the training courses and distant learning. Something interesting also happened last year. The University Regulatory Body, the National Universities Commission, has come up with a transnational education policy where AUST can work with CC to ensure that we run accredited WTO trade policy courses to ensure that this lack of access to trade policy training and capacity is addressed. And so we end by just looking briefly at what Nigeria's foreign policy is. Still launched in December, same period as Nigeria's latest trade policy, consists of 4 Ds: development, diaspora, demography, and democracy. And we believe that the development part of it provides a nexus between Nigeria's new trade policy, the trainings that are being done at WTO, which we intend to domesticate at AUST in Abuja for Africa and other developing countries, as well as Nigeria's foreign policy. And so we'll just recap by saying that trade policy, we see it as the software or the operating system of economic diplomacy. Nigeria has 2 new policies. It's 4D's foreign policy and its trade policy for 2023 to 2027. We believe that AUST working with CC will be able to expand access to trade policy and capacity building for Nigeria and in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Emeka. I want to say a very big thank you to all of our presenters, the management of the Center for the Study of Economies of Africa, CC, NOIPolls, and the Africa University of Science and Technology. There's a slight shift in the agenda. We're welcoming our founder and the distinguished Director General of the World Trade Organization, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo Iweala. This fireside chat should have happened right after the reflections by Professor Kingsley Moghalu and Ambassador Elijah. But due to changes in Dr. Okonjo's schedule, we would briefly hold this fireside chat now and jump back to the reflection. And I think that this is very important because it would give us an opportunity to hear from her and for her to also share her perceptions about today's conversation. I want to officially say welcome home, Dr. Ngozi. The last time that we were together was on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly in New York, where you spoke to the Global Africa Business Initiative. And I had the honor of being there. Thank you so much for your kindness. And one of the things that struck me in the conversation that you had with Foliva for Al Jazeera was when you spoke about your target for the ministerial conference and wanting to break a record by ensuring that countries ratify the agreement to place a ban on illegal fishing. There was a target for 110 members and 44 African countries, in fact. And with the ministerial conference ending in Abu Dhabi, you secured about 71 ratifications. And some people might think that that is not a broken record, but I think that that is, an A, if you ask me. So, with respect to how the WTO sort of fosters economic diplomacy, can you share with us how the WTO does it to sort of help countries reach a consensus? How does the WTO sort of foster economic diplomacy to uphold its rules-based system?
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, Your Excellencies, and thank you for being here, and it's wonderful to see Kingsley and other old friends also around the table. Well, you seem to know a lot about our ministerial conference, first of all. It's a very kind of technical area, so I'm a little surprised, but if you want to know about it, the ministerial conference, well, first, the WTO is a very unique organization in the sense that this is one of the few places in the world where there's a consensus decision-making system, meaning every little member, from those who have 300,000 population or 20,000, has the same voice as those who have 1.4 billion, or what the case may be. And there are not many places like that in the world. So this is really very, very interesting. And countries who become members feel very empowered. So consensus decision-making is very difficult. So whilst it's very empowering, it's also extremely challenging because it means any one member can stop an agreement. So when you talk about how do you foster economic diplomacy, it's very tough. It's very tough negotiating multilateral agreements in which every member has to be in agreement. And that's why I'm very proud that at our 12th ministerial, which was my first, 19 months ago, in June 2022, we were able, against all odds, when people had predicted failure, to be able to close more than, can you hear me? We were able to close so many multilateral agreements, more than 6 very important multilateral agreements. And if I add all of them up, actually it goes up to 10. Some of these agreements had been in negotiation for more than 2 decades. And part of it was the fisheries. So we have 2 legacy agreements. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah, 2 legacy agreements, agriculture and fisheries, that have been in negotiations for more than 2 decades. So fisheries was about trying to stop harmful subsidies that lead to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing of our high seas, and that lead to overfishing, overcapacity. We broke the negotiations into 2 parts. We first tackled illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, and we got that at MC12 after more than 2 decades. Some of you will recall that this is also SDG target 14.6, and the WTO was charged with delivering this. So this is something that made me extremely happy. Just to give you a figure, in 1970, our oceans were 7% overfished. Today, according to estimates of the Minderu Foundation, which is a leading edge foundation in Australia, we are 49% overfished. FAO figures are 38% overfished. So whether it's 38 or 49, we're on the wrong side of the ledger. So it was really important to stop this, sort of handing over to our children oceans without fish. But it's not good enough to just get an agreement. For me, ratifying it means it comes into effect. And that's why we were racing. And I kind of used MC13 as a hook in order to get WTO members to act faster than they would have. It takes 3+ years to ratify an agreement at the WTO, usually longer, 5 years, 10 years. And if we are talking about sustainability, we have to do it faster. So I knew we might not get all of the 110, but if I told members that we have to do it by MC13, they would act faster, and that proved right. Everyone was shocked. We got 71 ratifications, and the trend we are on now, I hope that we'll ratify it by this year. And I'm saying to people, my birthday is June. Can your country ratify before my birthday as a birthday present? And I'm very hopeful. So that's what that was about. So we got 71, not 110, but you can see I'm rather happy about it. And we had 11 ratifications delivered during MC13. So that was really beautiful, and we had a nice ceremony. So we have 38. Actually, we are now, when I get back to Geneva, I think there are 4 waiting. So countries, and I'm very proud that Nigeria was one of the very first to ratify the agreement. So our country did something right. When I get back, we will have 38. I have 4 more waiting, and we're looking for 38. We'll get them.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm listening and I'm hearing from you that this is all about strategy, and also there seems to be a systemic approach to getting countries to doing this in terms of economic diplomacy and how you deliver on the goals that you set. I also hear you in terms of timing, and I like that you sort of set realistic goals over a period of time that people can look towards those goals. Like your birthday, for example, is a landmark deadline for everyone. So thank you for sharing that strategy with us. You said something earlier about how every country at MC definitely did have equal opportunities. What does the WTO do specifically to support developing countries deal with their trade issues?
Well, one thing I'm proud about that is little known about the WTO, because many perceive it as a very technical agency, not sexy. They are not, we battle in Geneva because we've got the Human Rights Commission, we've got other very interesting things, and ambassadors far prefer to be engaged in those. So we really have to battle. But I want everyone to know that the WTO is really about people. The founding documents of the WTO in the Marrakesh Agreement says that the WTO's purpose is to enhance living standards, help create employment, and support sustainable development. So the WTO is the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, was a precursor to the WTO and morphed into the WTO. So WTO itself per se will be 30 this year, but I always think of it as 75 years old. And when they put those documents together 30 years ago, I thought it was really far-sighted to talk about supporting sustainable development. So it's about people. Okay, and that is the essence for me of what we have to deliver, the essence of getting countries to work together by constantly reminding them that the WTO is not just about negotiating agreements. And it's not all about lawyers. Sorry if there are many lawyers in the room. I'm not a lawyer, but I love lawyers, but. But, it's not about legal agreements only. Those agreements are for a purpose. And that purpose is to deliver for people. So I wanted to just highlight that about what we do. And so if you look at it and you work back, you look at all the agreements. So just allow me, I know I'm digressing a bit, but we have a fisheries agreement that's about deliveries for people, sustainability, and for the world, a global common good. We also house the world's intellectual property agreement. And during the pandemic, this became a huge topic about whether we could have flexibilities within the agreement to allow developing countries access, because they were standing at the back of the queue for vaccines. And therefore, how do we manage this so developing countries can manufacture vaccines for themselves? And one of the things I'm very proud of is that they were debating and people were dying, and we came in and said, we've got to find a compromise solution. It wasn't perfect. We were able to get flexibilities relaxed for 5 years, so developing countries who want to manufacture the vaccines can do so. So that's one of the things we got. Now, fast forward to MC13. For developing countries, what did we get? It wasn't much talked about in the press, maybe because these things are not so sexy to developed countries. But for a decade, 28 least developed countries who are members of the WTO, the poorest, have been trying to negotiate a transition period for when they graduate out of least developed country status into developing. They want the others to agree to give them a transition period to still benefit from the flexibilities in WTO agreements that are there for the poorest countries. And the argument was, even if we graduate, we don't know what the world will be like. The world economy may be in bad shape. We may slip back into least developed country status. So please give us a number of years of transition, maybe 3-4 years. Once things are solid, then we know. And but it was not easy. They were not able to get it for a decade. Bangladesh is graduating out of that status. It's one of those that we're talking about, and there are other countries. So they were able this time to negotiate a 3-year transition period, along with other flexibilities, which I don't need to go into now, but I'm very proud of that. And you know, the press doesn't talk about these things, but for me, being from a developing country, is very joyful to think that after a decade we're able to get this. The 90 developing countries at the WTO during MC13 also joined together to ask all the other members, especially the developed countries, that they want this, what is called special and differential treatment. There are other flexibilities available to developing countries in general in WTO agreements of the past. And they think they're not being effectively applied, and they wanted to go and look at them and see how can it benefit us more. Again, for a decade they've been arguing no agreement on even looking at this. Okay, so we got a declaration at MC13 with all members now agreeing that those 90 members, they're called the G90, they are now prepared to work with them to see how they benefit from these flexibilities. And this will be done in, taken forward in Geneva. And then the third thing I'm happy about is something very arcane called the e-commerce moratorium. In simple language, it's really an agreement not to tax digital trade, not to put customs duties on electronic transmissions, which is basically part of digital trade. Digital trade is the fastest growing segment of trade now. And digitally delivered services trade, meaning things like streaming services, professional services, back office services, accounting, even medicine delivered over the internet. All these things are growing at 8% per year. It's worth about $3.8 trillion now. And at the rate it's growing, it's going to grow very fast. So not taxing this means you give it an ecosystem in which it can develop. You can grow small and medium enterprises. And initially, developing countries were not so much in favor of this because they didn't see how it benefited them. But as more and more developing countries see that digital trade, there are small and medium enterprises, women running these enterprises, young people are in this ecosystem. Many of them swing to supporting the extension of this moratorium. For 28 years, they've been extending it. The idea is to make it permanent, but there are some members who don't like this. So Indonesia, India, Bangladesh, and South Africa had issues with it. And because of a consensus system, we could not get it done. But this time around, we agreed again to extend it for 2 more years, so there's a reprieve. It will end now March 31st, 2026. They said, let's end it. Any country that wants to charge can charge. Those who don't want don't have to. But let's give 2 more years. And I think this is okay because it gives business, big and small, time to plan. There are many developing countries, those ones I mentioned, who believe they are losing revenue. As a former finance minister, you have to listen to them and sympathize, because as trade becomes more digital and not goods-based, then, how do you get your revenue? Those who depend on customs duties. But we've tried to do studies with the IMF and so on that show that there may be more effective ways, like the VAT, to collect what you need than digital taxes on digitally delivered services. So we got that extended. That was another thing. One thing we did not get, where I'm a bit disappointed, is the second part of fisheries. We were negotiating the second fish 2 on overcapacity and overfishing. We didn't close that. But I'm not too unhappy. We're so close. So I think we can try and deliver it in Geneva. And finally, we didn't get agriculture. That didn't surprise me. This is an election here. There are farmers demonstrating in almost every country you can think of. It's highly politicized, and members were not able to come to agreement on some of the key provisions. That's not surprising. But I will tell you one thing. At MC12, for 2.5 decades, the agriculture negotiations have been on with no result. At MC12, we established a text and it failed when we got there. It was the only thing we didn't get at MC12. We got to MC13, a text was established, and the good thing I have to tell you, yes, we didn't get the negotiations, but the text is still valid. All members agreed to negotiate off of this text, so I have some hope down the line. So that's where we are. Sorry to be so long, but you can see I'm pretty excited about what we got, a bit disappointed at what we didn't get. But I think we didn't do too bad.
Well, thank you so much. Can we put our hands together for Dr. Okonjo? What I find interesting with your response is you pretty much responded to a question that I didn't ask you, which is the question on e-commerce and digital trade. And I want to give a shout out to our senior research fellow, Professor Emmanuel Wosu, who exposed me to a concept of strategic foresight. And I see that coming to play in your response here, where you seem to go ahead of the curve to sort of wait for the problem before it arrives and even begin solving it. So these are some of the insights that I'm taking away from you, and I wouldn't bother with asking that question. Because it's Women's History Month, please pardon me, I was also going to ask about specific initiatives that the WTO has for women, but I did my own little research and found nearly $50 million in funding made available to sort of boost trade for women. So instead of asking to sort of label that, I want to know what your message is to the women out there. You have a mantra which says that it's not about the opportunities before us, but how we use them. What is your message to women, not just in Nigeria, but all across the world, especially for Women's History Month?
Well, my message for women, I have total respect. Women are resilient, they're hardworking, many of them succeed against all odds, and I just want to say to women to keep going. Never give up the fight. I'm sorry, men in the room, I'm not, we need men supporting women because women can't do it alone, quite frankly. But women, have so many odds against them. I mean, it might look like women are succeeding because you have more female leadership in many positions. So things are improving, but they're improving at such a slow rate. And if you look at the numbers, you still see women everywhere. My dream is when they stop saying, she's the first woman to do this, and she's the first African, and she's the first this. People think I get excited when I hear that. I actually get depressed. When they say she's the first woman, and first African, and first this, I'm like, why? In this day and age. I don't want it to be that way. I want it to be that it's normal. Like when I was finance minister here, I was the first woman. And my dream, I worked hard in one way, and I know I was being invited to many places I didn't go. And I said to the women, the best thing I can do for women is really try to deliver. Because I want that when I leave, it becomes normal that a woman is finance minister. One of the things I'm really proud of is, yes, it did happen. And after I left, we had 2 women, 2 more, is it 3 even? So we want a situation in which women stop being firsts. And it's normal to have a woman leading. That's what I wish the women this month. I wrote a book about it with Julia Gillard called Women and Leadership. Julia Gillard is the first and only female Prime Minister of Australia, and she and I are friends. And when we found we had very similar experiences in leadership, we decided to write a book about it. And then we thought, well, maybe the two of us are odd. Let's go talk to other women leaders. And so we talked to them. We talked to Jacinda Ardern. We talked to Hillary Clinton. We talked to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and on. 8 women. And we found remarkably, and I talked to Angela Merkel later on, and it was the same story. She's not in the book, but I had a meeting with her where we talked these things over, and she had exactly the same kinds of experience. So we try to capture. We're not telling you what to do, but what we say to women leaders is, this is what you might encounter. So be ready. We can't change it, but at least if you know this is what is going to happen, it helps you to build resilience. Women need to be very resilient. So that's my message.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. The Director General of the World Trade Organization, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo Iweala.
Thank you. And thank you so much for taking your precious time to listen. Okay. She said pictures.
Dr. Nkrumah?
Very quick. We didn't answer anything about pictures.
Please join us on stage briefly.
Thank you so much. Really lovely seeing all of you.
All right. Please, I crave your indulgence. Can you please settle in? Sorry for the interruptions. Thank you all so much. We can agree that Dr. Ngozi Okonjo Iweala is a force. We're always in awe of our founder. We're going to close down this event by coordinating a discussion which seeks to reflect on the various presentations that we have heard here today. Very shortly, please can we be quiet? Very shortly, we're going to hear from Professor Kingsley Moghalu, the President of the Institute for Governance and Economic Transformation. Professor Moghalu's experience really cuts across as an interdisciplinary one. He has had a dynamic career, even starting out as a journalist, lawyer. He definitely is one of our key players in the foreign policy space. And now, president of one of Nigeria's foremost think tanks, the Institute for Governance and Economic Transformation. It'll be such a delight to sort of hear what your perceptions about the various presentations are, and any specific questions you have for the presenters. And then we will also hear from Ambassador Inyaba, who is a very fine Nigerian diplomat and has represented the interest of Nigeria in the mission in Burundi. Professor Moghalu, Dr. Chukwuka has stepped out briefly, so perhaps you would begin with the perception polls presentation and the capacity building presentation on trade and economic diplomacy before we return to the original presentation on Nigeria economic diplomacy. What were some of the things that caught your eyes in the presentation, and what specific questions do you have for the presenters?
Thank you. Well, thank you. Good evening, distinguished ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. I should say that in addition to being president of the Institute for Governance and Economic Transformation, I also happen to be the chairman of the Africa Private Sector Summit, the APSS, which is a pan-continental organization that works to promote trade and investment in Africa in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So it's something that keeps us very active, but I'll talk about it a little bit later. Let me, first of all, thank the presenters. On the matter of perception and perception polls, perception is a reflection of awareness. You must first be aware before you can perceive. And so one of the problems we have is that the nature of economic diplomacy is an elite enterprise, mostly. And so that limits perceptions of it by, the average person. Of course, the diplomats follow very closely, and they have their views. But I would want to widen the issue of perception away from the elite focus to what about the women SMEs? What about the SME women, the traders who trade across the border, across semi-border with Benin Republic or with Togo, those kinds of people. A lot of the informal trade involves those kinds of people. So I would like to see, to know their perceptions. Dr. Ngozi Okonjo Iweala spoke about, some of the work they're doing to support women in trade. Again, do many of our, ordinary women traders know? The women who are business executives would know. But again, at the bottom of the pyramid, my concern is very heavily there. And so when we talk about trade, one of the examples I want to mention is that many people do not know, but it took China about 15 years to join the WTO. They did not join as a matter of strategy. They did not join immediately in 1995. The Chinese ambassador, I believe, is here, the representative of China. They educated their citizens. They even created a WTO dictionary for Chinese business people, everyday business people, so that every aspect of economic activity in China was educated and informed to begin to anticipate this new global economic order and how China could take advantage of it. Russia did not sign for 19 years because they were holding out on some issues concerning oil and gas. So I just wanted to thank the presenter and to say that it was a very good service that you did for us by sharing with us some of those things, but to request that we shift or include the sort of more bottom of the pyramid people in our perception studies of economic diplomacy as represented by trade. So that's the first comment that I will make. On the matter of capacity, again here, African countries have a lot of issues. We don't have very strong capacity in trade. And I liked very much, and I'll combine the presentations. The presentation from the African University of Science and Technology was very, very insightful in talking about the response to economic diplomacy in the Nigerian Foreign Ministry, even internally inside the establishment itself. And I like the shift from the black bomb to economic diplomacy. That was a very interesting one. In a couple of days, I will be meeting with both the initiator of the black bomb and the initiator of economic diplomacy. Both are very good senior friends of mine. I want to say that it's very important that we invest in technical capacity in trade. And I'm glad that the Center for the Study of Economies of Africa is taking a lead on this. The Institute for Governance and Economic Transformation, the think tank I founded, is also very interested in this, and perhaps it's an area where we could have a strong partnership, seeing that I'm also playing an important role on the continent on trade issues, intra-African trade especially. And that brings me to the substantive comment I want to make, because of course it's one thing to comment on your presentations, but I also have one or two things of my own to say. And as I was saying to my Brazilian friend, in introducing myself, I'm a man who was never accused of not having anything to say. So I wanted to just comment that on the matter of economic diplomacy generally, Nigeria has very strong possibilities, very strong potentials. The Economic Commission for West Africans, Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, is, in my view, the biggest success of Nigeria's economic diplomacy in history. The formation of ECOWAS was, at the instance, the drive of Nigeria's leadership, specifically General Yakubu Gowon at that time in the early 70s. So it's a very big victory for us and has indeed had very good impact for the West African sub-region and became one of the regional economic communities on the back of which we now have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Now, the problem that we have regarding economic diplomacy in Nigeria is that our prospects are complicated by three things. The first complication or drawback to our achieving our potential in economic diplomacy is what we trade. What we trade. The second is how we trade. And the third is a weak business environment, a weak environment for doing business. Let me briefly talk about what we trade. Many people know that in the 13th century, the 14th century, Africa had empires that were great empires, trading with the rest of the world. The Empire of Mali, the Empire of Songhai, the Empire of Ghana. And the richest man in the world at that time was Mansa Musa. And we know the story of how he went to Mecca and caused inflation on his path to Mecca, the way he was distributing gold ingots. But today, 7 centuries later, Africa is still trading mainly in gold and oil. Those are the two biggest things we trade and export in the world today, and that's a problem because it makes your export base very monolithic, and so you're not competitive in global trade. So what we trade is a problem. Oil, is our main thing. And so our exports in this country account only for 10% of our GDP. If you compare that to Malaysia and you compare that to Brazil, it's about 70-something% of GDP that export trade occupies. So what we trade is a drawback we need to, and that comes to the question of economic complexity. We will not go into too much detail here, but until we are able to diversify our economies and we're able to find the part of the global value chains that we can master and contribute as our contribution to global trade, we will continue to have problems. One economist says that, look, globalization is like a bullet train. You have to have a platform for it to stop at your station. The platform is your being part of the global value chain system. So what is it we're contributing to the components that make up manufactures, which are 75% of global trade now? The second obstacle is how we trade. We trade globally, whereas the wealthiest countries of this world are trading mainly regionally. Much of our trade from Nigeria is with, and because of what we trade, we're at a disadvantage because all we're busy is exporting mainly raw materials and importing finished goods. So that's a problem of strategy, which I think needs to change. Europe, 70% of all of Europe's trade is within Europe. 60% of all of Asia's trade is in Asia. 40% of all of North America's trade is in North America. Only 16% of Africa's trade is within Africa. That means that over 85% of our trade is with the rest of the world, and you're not competitively positioned because you're exporting minerals or raw agricultural commodities. So if this is the case, it means that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is Africa's chance and opportunity to actually use economic diplomacy to the advantage of its citizens through trade. You see? So we need to trade a lot more within Africa. And for us to be able to do that, Nigeria, for example, is in a commanding position. And yet, we were one of the last people to ratify the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Why? because people were very scared that, foreign countries, powerful countries, could use other African countries, manipulate the rules of origin to flood the Nigerian market and so on. But Nigeria has an opportunity with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, for sure, And when we talk about that, I now come to the third obstacle, the role of the private sector. The private sector is what will drive Nigeria's economic diplomacy. It's not the government officials signing treaties. It's the businessmen, the businesswomen who are trading across borders. For this to happen, the business environment on the continent must be an enabling one. And this is the prime goal of the Africa Private Sector Summit, the APSS, that I have the honor and privilege to serve as chairman of the board. We have a board that's from across all the 5 regions of Africa, North, South, East, West, Central, and then the diaspora as well. So we have, oh, is Chemery here? Do you have a copy of the, yes, please bring it. Let me just use it as a demonstration. The Africa Private Sector Summit has come up with what we call a charter on the private sector bill of rights. And this is it. We have about 25 specific rights that we're asking all African governments to ratify at the 2025 summit of the African Union. And if they ratify it and domesticate it, African businesses will be able to thrive a lot more. For example, the basic right to a stable and secure environment. Look at all the security challenges we're having in parts of Nigeria. Can anybody trade in those parts? Look at how it's affecting agriculture. Look at how it's affecting inflation, price stability. So the right to a stable environment is just number one. African countries, including Nigeria, need to understand that security has very significant economic implications for prosperity. And many other rights, the right to competitive, free competition. We cannot continue to encourage monopolies in Nigeria and in Africa. We have to have tax that is fair, simple, and effective, not multiple taxation. Then the whole matter of trade facilitation, which came up again in the discussion with Dr. Okonjo Iweala. We found in our studies that the biggest contributor to improving and increasing trade and prosperity in Africa is simply to reform the port system, the borders, the customs system, the processes of international trade and handling cargoes, making them effective will create a massive boost. So let me, wrap up there by saying that this is a very important discourse on Nigeria's economic diplomacy, and it's an area of huge strategic advantage for Nigeria. I'd like to thank all our partners, all the ambassadors here, for your support for this initiative. I'm not speaking on behalf of the center, but I'm just speaking as a Nigerian, that it's very good to see the level of interest and support. There's a lot of room for collaboration. Global trade can be a win-win situation. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing. And many African countries are saying that for too long, global trade has been to the advantage of the industrialized countries and not of enough benefit to the developing countries. And of course, the consensus nature of the WTO, where you have the single undertaking system, the all or nothing, everybody has to agree, or there's no agreement, makes it very difficult, big challenge. But I like Ngozi's birthday diplomacy approach, and it's something for us to learn from. Everybody should go and mark her birthday in the calendar and try to give her some nice presents that will make her happy. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to say a few words. Thank you very much. And we have a lot of work to do in this space, and it's very promising. But we need to have the capacity to actually do it. And that's where the training on trade policy is very, very important. Because if you go to the negotiations in the forums where these things are negotiated, you need a lot of in-depth expertise about trade, international trade policy. And it's an area where we have a lot of work to do. Not because we lack the talent, but simply because we have not focused on it, and we need to do so from now on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll just allow for a quick rebuttal. I don't know that you want to speak on the things Professor Mogali has said. Is there any feedback or questions? We have to democratize the process. Yes, please.
Thank you. Yes, I do have a question because except for having worked as a trade delegate.
Hechi, would you mind doing a brief introduction?
Peter Linknecht, the Belgian ambassador here in Nigeria. And so in a previous stage of my career, I've been a trade negotiator at the WTO for 4 years, but it's a while ago. I also spent a similar number of years in East Africa, in Kenya. And now, Professor, you just mentioned that the establishment of ECOWAS was probably the biggest victory in terms of economic diplomacy for Nigeria so far, and I'm eager to believe that. But when it comes to the elaboration and actual implementation, I've always been struck how, and of course Europeans, we usually believe quite strongly in trade regionalism and in the potential it might also have elsewhere in the world. But very struck by how differently it panned out in East Africa and West Africa. And for instance, what I noticed is that in East Africa, the biggest economic motor of that region, Kenya, is also the one that is most savvy on trading and in trading regionally, where we find Tanzania usually a bit backtracking and all of that. But here, curiously, in West Africa, it looks like the biggest protectionist force has been the biggest country, the supposedly economic motor of the region. And it also within Nigeria, we are told, and not only in the ECOWAS context, but for instance, also when we are negotiating between regions, EU and West Africa, that it is that we find some resistance within Nigeria and particularly within its private sector, even more than within its government, which I find even a bigger paradox. So how would you explain some of that?
Well, I was looking for the person who would rebut me, and I think we found someone. Thank you, Ambassador. Very, very excellent insights that you have brought to the discussion. That goes to the internal dynamics of our country. There is a very significant protectionist instinct in the country. This comes from its history. Because, you know, the Nigeria started out as, I wouldn't say socialist economy, but very high level of government involvement in the economy. And that, you know, kind of meant that the government was in front on industries, in front on trade with, you know, commodity boards and all those kinds of things. Now, over the years, it started shifting to a more open and liberalized system, especially under General Babangida in the 80s. But that transition was not completed. And in fact, at some point, it has been reversed. Certainly under President Buhari, there was a tendency to what I call economic nationalism. So what we need, this is where the training on trade policy comes in. Because many people in the private sector, they are protectionist because the enabling environment for them does not exist. And so they find, because the business environment, electricity is a big problem in this country. And so there's a problem for their efficiency as private sector companies. So they have a morbid fear of what foreign imports or foreign trade from countries that have basic amenities and can produce cheaply will do for their markets and for their competitiveness, even in Nigeria. I'm just explaining the reason for this. And so, for example, anybody who wants to defeat this tendency, for example, Belgium, if Belgium gets into an agreement or some alignment that gives Nigeria 20, 30, 40 megawatts of electricity within the next 3 to 5 years, and challenges Nigeria to drop all its protectionism, it's a win-win, you know? But now let me come to the responsibility of the government. The government itself, knowing that it has not always, but let me go back, and there's a philosophical instinct also in some of the leaders that we have had. President Obasanjo was very pro-market, but you know, Jonathan was also pro-market, but we know that President Buhari was not. And so for the past 10 years, there has been what I would call populism, you know, being misunderstood as economic policy. So the training that we should give to Nigeria's trade policy officials and government officials and the private sector should explain to them that the world is all joined together. Nobody can be an island anymore. And so what you have to do is to become competitive. What you have to do is to find the parts of the value chain that you can contribute. We've had issues with China as well. And even in WTO, we know that there are trade disputes between countries, whether the United States and China and all that. So trade is not just all good. Countries are advancing their strategic national interests with trade as well. So training needs to show our government and our private sector why and how they can be competitive in global trade, especially regional trade. And when they have that knowledge, they will have the confidence to become less and less protectionist. That's what I would say. Of course, I will conclude by saying we know that many of the advanced countries are not as liberal when it comes to admitting finished products from the developing countries. They are very happy to admit our raw materials. And in fact, the tariffs are much lower. So that's also an issue, you know, that has to be addressed. You know, we on our part have challenges of quality assurance, and that's why the WTO has just inaugurated a few days ago, yesterday, very, very important to make sure that our products meet the necessary quality standards to penetrate the markets of advanced industrial economies. But beyond that, there has to be a greater openness to value-added exports from African countries like Nigeria to the Western world. And then, two can dance. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I'd like us to quickly hear from Ambassador Elijah Onyaba, the former Nigerian ambassador to Burundi, who would also share his synthesis on the presentations that were just conducted.
Thank you very much. I'd like to appreciate the Center, NOI, and of course representative of the AUST for the opportunity to invite me here to share my hands-on experience on diplomacy generally and of course specifically economic diplomacy. Thank you very much, big brother, for the time and the wonderful presentation you made. But let me just kick off from the last presentation, which has to talk about protectionism. And I think some of these things have to be very clear as to the reason why. Because I think for us as a country, there's also a need to protect our local industries as well. The reason is because, yes, there's liberalization and globalization, but at the same time, there has to be, for our economic diplomacy to succeed here, there has to be a mix of the liberalization and sometimes even restriction. Because, for example, how can a rice miller in Nigeria that has been milling for 5 years compete with a Thailand miller that has been in the business for over 100 years? How can a textile company in Kaduna, for example, compete with a Chinese or Vietnam textile industry that has also been in the business for a very long time? So yes, we understand that point, but maybe when it comes to food and all of that, we need to have some kind of restrictions. But when it comes to technology, driven products, yes, we have to be liberal. But of course, the ultimate agenda, ultimate plan must also be to domesticate it, because that's where I think that we're missing out, trying to ensure that as we engage in this trade and engage in some of these, bilateral and multilateral agreements, that we also find a way to retain the to have, knowledge and technology transfer that can help our local industry grow. My name is Elijah again. I worked as Nigerian ambassador to the Republic of Burundi for the past 3 years. And Nigeria maintains, we currently have about 120 diplomatic missions in Nigeria at the moment, embassies, consulates, international organizations, and we have about 109 residents across the world. And clearly, what is important at this point in time, I enjoyed the presentation, obviously, creating a platform for economic diplomacy to come to focus, because there is no better time to talk about it than now. The entire country is experiencing a lot of reform. So the platform you've created will become a very good platform as we continue to engage. The only sad part is that I expected to see representatives from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I believe that even there's a desk called the Economic Trade and Investment Directorate, Ambassador Bolaji. I believe he should have been here at the moment, because there has to be that partnership. Nigeria at the moment have recalled all the ambassadors, but I'm sure that in another couple of months they will all be out again. So this is the kind of discourse that I believe that it should all be round on the table. The AUST presentation talked about the pillars, the 4 pillars of this current administration's foreign policy. A lot of them actually, the 4 of them actually are economic driven. Talking about development is how do you attract investment into the country using your demography and leveraging on the power of your diaspora. These are all economic tools that I believe that they should be here, because that partnership needs to be there for us to be able to make progress. It's very important that as we continue to engage, Nigeria is a very interesting country. The market is here, and therefore, as we engage, I think that there are 2 models of economic diplomacy. The champions we have in economic diplomacy is the West and China, for example. You already, Professor Kingsley Morgan, they talked about what China have done. Their model is very interesting, and you can criticize it as much as you want, but China is very clear of what they want from Africa, even from Nigeria specifically, because they are here to, they give you infrastructure, but the company that must do this infrastructure must be Chinese companies, and sometimes even the labor also comes from China. So you end up having the infrastructure you so desire, but the people largely, quite a lot of the funding that will come into the project will find its way to China. I have issues with that, but I won't blame them, because they are very clear on what the objectives are. In fact, even when they lend those monies, they are very liberal when it comes to economic and political conditions. Quite unlike when you look at the West, that obviously may want to fund through the Bretton Woods institution that will also be specific and clear as to whatever political and social and even economic conditions they want to be in place before you get all of those things done. But I think that it is for us to think. It's for Nigeria and African countries to sit back and think. Most of the ambassadors that I see here on the table all have, I'm sure, I'll be surprised if your countries don't have bilateral agreements with Nigeria. I'll be very surprised, because you start by maybe establishing a joint commission, then you have some kind of business council, and then you have like business summits, and then you have platforms for bilateral engagements with the country. And at some point, the private sector also comes in to take advantages of those MOUs that have been signed and see how their companies can find expression. So I think that it's for us to take a back seat, think about how to engage, because that level, we have a lot of agricultural participation in Nigeria, a lot of farming takes place in Nigeria. But again, look at the product, what we get. How many? A lot of us use phones here. How many bags of maize do you think is going to be equivalent to these phones, or how many? So clearly, there's a lot of work that we need to do as a people, and I believe that this platform has come at a good time, and I like the capacity development part, which is being championed by the AUST. I think that there's a lot of collaboration that you can have with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Director of Technical Aid Corps, the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs. I think these are the government representatives that we can find a way to bring together. Even the Foreign Service Academy, for example, some of the conversations going on here also needs to be where we are breeding our diplomats, because everybody must go out with the understanding of what Nigeria's economic diplomacy focus should be. So I think I don't want to take a lot of time, but that's actually my preliminary, contribution to the discourse going on today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Wow, this has been such a long conversation, but also a very informative one as well. I can see a hand raised. I'll just permit you to make your contribution before we wrap up.
Thank you very much. I believe my voice is loud enough.
Yes.
My name is Air Vice Marshal Chris Chukwu, retired, and I am a staff of the African University of Science and Technology. My very short, two quick comments. One, I was highly excited when Your Excellency, of course, talked about ECOWAS, the success of ECOWAS in economic dimension. And I also want to lend a voice there because ECOWAS is also the only regional economic organization that has a security perspective that has so far been proven fairly successful in backing its economic policies with a security arm. I want to also link it with the perception polls for the benefit of our colleagues from the embassies from the other foreign countries. Nigeria is quite large and quite diverse. Great perception polls will give us amazing information, but also they are also sentimental. They can be sentimental. They can be prone to social media manipulation. And so what I'm trying to say is that perhaps the reality of our security situation, the reality of our national stability situation may not be what it looks like. Nigeria has always had one crisis or the other since 60 or so. Yet we have continued to remain economically stable and vibrant and strong. So I want us to look from the big picture perspective. So let me put it aside. Now, coming to the my constituency, the aspect of capacity building, I wish the Director General was here, but thank God we are here with the CSEA people. What can we do to looking at our institution, the African University of Science and Technology, as being Pan-African and looking at capacity building from a very big picture, from an African picture, and from a modern approach to training? What could be done to reduce or limit some of the limitations that we have in enabling us to access and take advantage of a lot of the incentives that we know that the WTO and other United Nations, other foreign international organizations have for training towards this economic diplomacy or economic development. Can we please look at what can be done to help us to access these benefits with less and less stringency? And I think something could be done in that part. So thanks a lot. That's what I want to say.
Thank you so much. We would have that as our parting reflection. What can be done? And I think that is such a beautiful question to sort of close this event. Ladies and gentlemen, we would now invite Sir Etigwe Uwa, SAN. Please, with a round of applause, let us welcome members of the board of CSEA, NOIPolls, and the Africa University of Science and Technology, who would give the vote of thanks.
Thank you very much. Your Excellencies, invited guests, I have the unique the unique advantage of being connected to all three organizations, AUST, NOI, and CSEA. So we are very, very, very grateful that you honored our invitation and found time to come. It's been an afternoon very, very well spent. It's been very illuminating. And I believe that the discussions that we've had today will really help in boosting our trade policy as a country. Thank you so very much for coming. We're very grateful. Thank you. And as you go back, safe travels. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please let's welcome our Director of Research here at the Center for the Study of the Economies of Africa for our closing remarks. Dr. Deji will sort of share what the immediate next steps are for NEDD and what to expect in the coming months. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Adedeji Adelino.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think everybody enjoyed the conversation the way I've done this afternoon. I think what we intended with this conversation, I think it has been achieved. I think there is no better way. I think we could anticipate the launching of this dialogue. What we intended is to have it data-driven because we have centers. I mean, one of the problems we will see in Nigerian society is around data. But I think when you come to us, we have capacity in both making sense of existing data, but also in generating new data. So our conversation, you should expect that it will be data-driven and it will enrich whatever you do in various aspects. I also think it's an exchange of ideas, and I think we've seen that today. It's bring about people that have different opinions, but I think they have similar goals in terms of what we want to achieve. We want to see development in Nigeria, in Africa, and globally. And that's actually our agenda in terms of bringing people that can actually shape ideas. We also think about partnership, and I think this is part of why we bring everybody to the room to build partnership. But I think the last point to really see, what we want to see in this conversation is inclusive narrative. Not just about the big picture in terms of the macro, but I think Professor Moga, you talked about how we need to bring the women, the rural areas, and all these local issues into the conversation. So when we talk about diplomatic, please don't let us think it's very too high level. Of course, it's high level, it's global discussion, but also it's very localized. So that's part of what you would be seeing in this conversation. And that's why we think you should be part of this. And anytime we call upon you to be part of that conversation. In terms of the next steps, I want to say first, this is just a new product, emerging product that we are starting off. So we're still open to just suggestions in shaping this. So whatever you think you can shape the agenda for subsequent dialogue, we welcome them. And our door is open for whatever discussion you have. Also, we want this to be very, to not just be one shot. We want it to be continuous and periodic. And we want to hear what agenda you want us to really set. We don't just want to shape the agenda. We want to hear from you in terms of what the agenda should be. And that is part of the partnership we talked about, whereby it is actually consensus building going forward. The last thing is, I want to say that as the three institutions, our doors are always open for partnership beyond this and in various areas. We are research data collection institutions, and we enrich local and global debates. And for that reason, we think you should look us as a partner that you should work with going forward in whatever things you think or problems, research that you encounter in your work. Our door is always open. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you very soon. Again, thank you.
Thank you all so much on behalf of the management of the Center for the Study of the Economies of Africa, NOIPolls, and the Africa University of Science and Technology. I want to thank you all for your time, for your patience, and of course for listening, which of course is one of the key ingredients of today's discourse. Thank you so much, Professor Mogalu. Thank you so much, Ambassador. A key component of our closing now is networking. Please say hello to a few persons, give them your cards, and make sure you keep in touch. Thank you all so much, and hopefully see you next year.